Hello and welcome to another episode of the Fully Charged Plus podcast. This is going to be a solo podcast, a bit shorter than usual. We're going through some restructuring at a management level. No, we're going through some sort of adjustments as we recover from the extraordinary success of the Fully Charged Outside show that was a couple of weeks ago. Which was amazing and truly spectacularly wonderful. And I think everyone who came along really enjoyed it, which is kind of important. If you're looking at things from a long-term perspective, that was a really hopeful sign. You know, how much people enjoyed it, how much incredibly positive feedback we got from it. It was amazing. It's sort of exhausting for, actually not for me. I had a brilliant time. I managed to pace myself. I've learnt from previous live shows we've done. I have to have a little lie down every now and then in a dark corner, usually a cupboard. I like to get in there with the brooms and the mops. But it was fantastic, and everyone there was so wonderful, and we were blessed beyond belief by the weather. We were very, very lucky. So that was really great. That was fantastic. And now we're trying to sort of rejig things, because a lot of focus was on getting that done. And we've got to keep making the shows. And as regular viewers of Fully Charged will be very aware, we've just done 3 episodes from the Munich car show, which happened immediately after Fully Charged Outside Live. So Jack Scarlett and lovely Andy, the cameraman, like the next day after filming all day at Fully Charged, there to get on a plane. First time anyone from Fully Charged flown anywhere. Fly to Munich. And film the show, and there's a lot more stuff to come from that. It was an amazing trip they had, which was such a relief. I just want to explain something. Jack is a man in his 20s who's got an incredible enthusiasm and energy, get up and go. He's full of everything, and he's amazingly knowledgeable about cars and incredibly enthusiastic, and it's such a relief that old man Llewellyn could come back home, do a bit of ironing, have a shower, have a boiled egg, dippy egg. It was nice. Sit in the garden with a cup of tea and have a look at the birds, feed the chickens. That was quite a relief to be able to do that and not to rush off immediately doing something else. So that was very nice and very successful, which is always a great relief. Just before I go any further, because I've got a few stories I want to do, which I think are really interesting and pertinent to the channel, I just want to give the opportunity for a quick word from our glorious Fully Charged Plus podcast sponsor. Let's hear something from them. My Energy is putting the I back into British innovation. My Energy is putting the I back into inventing the future. My Energy is putting the I back into inspiring a nation. Recharging the world with green, smart energy. Charge your EV with your PV and more. Visit myenergy.com and help to spark the green revolution. My Energy, driving the charge to a greener future. Okay, well, on with the show. Now, a big story in the UK at the moment is the price of gas. It's been in the news. The price of energy in this country. And what it's unveiling is the inherent delicacy of our energy system and how reliant we are on importing fuel from all over the world. I mean, in the case of gas, it is chiefly Norway and Russia, and in a sort of distant third place, Saudi Arabia, because we get shiploads of gas from Saudi. But we get pipeline gas from Norway and President Putin, and it's very kind of him. The price of gas has increased a little bit in the last, this year, and specifically in the last month or so. So the industry group Oil and Gas UK, a business and industry group in this market, have informed us that the wholesale prices for gas are up 250% since January, with a 70% rise since August. Well, that's nice, isn't it? So that is going to be reflected in every aspect of our lives, our electricity bills, if you use gas for cooking or heating, it's going to be reflected in that. It's going to be more expensive. There's just no way around it. Now, our lovely energy minister, Mr. Kwarteng, has assured the British public that there's no danger of shortages, but there is quite a big danger of incredibly high prices, which he doesn't sort of go on about. And there's also quite a large chance that the smaller energy companies, some of them are going to go out of business because they work on such tight, profit margins that those profit margins will disappear in an instant. I just want to explain to people outside the UK that one of the advantages of the deregulation of our energy and telecommunications systems, this is why things aren't black and white, isn't it? So when I was a kid and until I was in my early adulthood, sort of most big networked energy communication systems, the National Health Service, everything was nationalised. That happened after the war. So 10, 15 years before I was born, these changes took place. Really remarkable changes. The railways, everything was nationalised. It was all run by the government. And it's fairly obvious now that in certain instances, that isn't a good idea. And in certain other instances, it's literally critically important. So let's go very quickly, brush over the National Health Service, which the current administration are trying to privatise and probably will. But in other aspects, and I think this is really important, personally, a very quick personal story. I moved into a flat with my lifelong friend Christoph in the early 1980s, and we asked if we could have a phone, and we were told we'd have to wait between 3 and 5 years because there were no numbers available. This was under a nationalised phone network. 3 to 5 years. Eventually, from hassling, we got one in about 18 months. But it did take that long. And then the telecoms industry was privatised by Margaret Thatcher and the Thatcher government, along with a lot of other things. But let's just go with phones for the minute. And I moved into another flat and I said, we want to get a phone in this flat. There was no phone installed, as there weren't in lots of places. It's hard to go back to think back how unusual it was to have a telephone as opposed to absolutely standard. There was no line into the house. So we rang up in the morning, said we want to put a phone in, thinking it would be a couple of weeks because the whole thing had changed. The guy came in the afternoon. We had a phone by 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the same day that we moved in and asked if we could have a phone. And we had to go to a phone box with some small change, put that in the slot to ring up. That's how you did it in those days. And so I think there was an enormous benefit to denationalising, to privatising the telephone and telecoms system. And it was a huge benefit to everyone. It made phones easier to get, cheaper. It started and encouraged and facilitated the explosion in cell phones and the cell phone industry and all that stuff. So those are all good things. The railways, it's debatable because they were pretty awful in the UK when they were nationalised. Then they were privatised. And I would say it's debatable at how much better they are. They are incredibly expensive and not terribly reliable. And it's an absolute national disgrace that our rail network isn't like other European rail networks, where you can get on a train for a tenth of the price it would cost you to drive. And they're clean and they're fast and they're reliable and they're always on time and they work. People use them, the train system. And this is every country in Europe I've been in. It's just a much better system than we have in the UK. So that's that. Now, what am I getting back to? The energy system. The energy system, it was British Gas, which was a nationalised industry. And I can't even remember who did it. It was a localised sector of the world you got your electricity from, but it was basically nationalised industry. That was privatised as well. That went through, through various levels of chaos and success. But generally, it's been a beneficial thing, and it's allowed people to set up companies, specifically since the explosion in renewable energy. Set up companies that have a different approach to how you buy your electricity, when it's cheap, when it's expensive, different tariffs, all those things. And one of those companies, this is an example of what's happened recently with the gas and electricity price. One of those companies is Octopus. That's who I buy my electricity from. And they have a tariff called the Agile tariff, which if you don't have batteries in your house, you really would be an idiot to use. It's the most expensive electricity you can possibly buy in the UK at peak times. And so I've been on that tariff for about a year. I've just stopped. Been on it for about a year. And there are periods of the day when you pay 35 pence a kilowatt hour, which is getting on for 40, 50 cents American, and 40, 50 euros, euro cents a kilowatt hour. So expensive electricity, much more than most people in the UK paying between 15 and 20 pence. So that is, brutal if you're paying it. But obviously with batteries and with solar, I managed to avoid paying that price. And there are times, and I've experienced it 3 times, where that price goes negative. And this is due to offshore wind. So if there's an enormous amount of offshore wind at night, they're trying not to curtail it, i.e. turn the turbines off. They're trying to use that electricity, and you can actually be paid to consume electricity. And this has happened for a long time, which as general consumers, we wouldn't know about. But big companies that are heavy electricity users, they will often be used as a sort of a balancing method. So they will continue to use electricity when it's very cheap. And in fact, they will be paid to use electricity. And now that's been handed on to individual consumers. And that's why privatizing the energy system, I think, was a very good thing. And I've had 3 nights. One night was really spectacular. I used something around 70 kilowatt hours of electricity, which is charging 2 cars and the batteries in my house and heating the hot water. And that I got paid around £2. I got paid, i.e. it came off my bill. So, not an enormous amount of money, but it reduced on my bill, and it cost me nothing to fully charge 2 cars, fully charge the batteries. Massive advantage. What an incredible privilege and advantage to be able to do that. Well, that's happened 3 times in a year. I was under the fantasy impression that was going to be every 2 days. It's very, very unusual. And what's happened in the last month, really, but specifically the last 2 weeks, is that price of electricity has just stayed pretty much 24 hours a day at 35 pence a kilowatt hour. That is the cut-off peak that Octopus charge their customers. The actual electricity at some times would have cost over £1 a kilowatt hour if you were paying the real market rate. It's been incredibly expensive and it's entirely down to the gas price. It's not down to wind suddenly being expensive, or even nuclear, or even coal. It is down to gas. We're very reliant on gas still in this country, burning imported gas. So imagine how much money is going out of our economy to pay for that gas at the moment. Unimaginable amounts. Now, the other problem we've had is we've had a very large area of high pressure over the whole of the United Kingdom, which means there's not that much wind, which means wind generation has been unusually low. Offshore wind has been unusually low. There's no point trying to deny it. We know it's variable. We're very aware of that. And what we have to do in the next 10 years, really that soon, we've got to do this sooner, is install way, way more wind turbines. And what is amazing is even the current administration, who I've already revealed I'm not a big fan of, they've all come out and said this. This shows how important it is to expand our renewable energy portfolio. Those are quotes from government ministers. We have to have more offshore wind, because the more offshore wind you have installed, even when it is quite still, they're not turning. It's never like static air out in the North Sea or in the Atlantic or in the Irish Sea. There's never no wind. There can be very low wind. So we need to obviously be able to produce way more electricity from that. We need way more solar on people's homes. We need way more batteries in people's homes so that the demand can be reduced at critical times, which we've just been through. And I think the current administration do understand that, which is really, really encouraging. And it does mean, we really have to do that. But it's still a massive challenge. And this is a really good example of that massive challenge, that we're not in a period of really high demand at the moment. It's been very warm in the UK, unusually warm. So we're not having a lot of people using their heating, and it's still quite light. It's quite summery, so there's less demand on the grid in general, although a huge chunk of the demand on the grid is industrial rather than domestic. But even that, so we're having there's all manner of knock-on problems coming from the gas price. But we have to, we have to find solutions to this in the next 10 to 15 years. And clearly, there are loads of solutions, and in fact, next week's podcast, I discuss them in great detail with people who actually know about these things. But I just thought that was an interesting problem we're going through, and these are going to happen all over the world. I mean, the one I talked about on Fully Charged earlier this year in Texas, where the Texan grid, for those of you who don't know, is isolated from the rest of the national grid in the United States, and they really suffer the consequence of that. What you want is to be connected to your neighbours, which is always a bit awkward in this country. And the other reason we've got problems with electricity and the electricity price is a huge interconnector that connects us to France caught fire. There's one in Kent, I believe. And that's out of action till probably next March. Well, we import vast wallops of electricity from France, and we sometimes send them power. And we've got huge amounts of excess wind power, which is very common. That is a very common event. If anything, that's far more common than when we are in the position we are at the moment, where it's very still. We already can overproduce. Well, that is a good thing. We can now send that to countries. Probably less France, but certainly Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, those countries will effectively buy electricity from us. We are connected to all those countries with essentially nothing more spectacular than very big fat wires that lie across the seabed. And it's where they join on to our grid on land is where the problem was. There was a fire in one of those interconnectors. We've just completed installing an interconnector, a huge one, from the northeast of the UK to Norway. And the whole notion of that connection is that we can shift the huge amounts of offshore wind we have in the North Sea when we don't need it. With those, we wouldn't turn those turbines off. They'd be going all the time, and if we weren't using the electricity, it would be sent to Norway to pump water up mountains. That's our battery, and that is a really, really brilliant piece of engineering that the National Grid have undertaken, and obviously the Norwegian government will be a joint project. So that's fantastic, and that hasn't quite come online yet. It's only just joined up. We are, as a matter of interest, we are doing a lot of stuff at COP26 with the National Grid. We're presenting a film there, which they've commissioned, and a panel discussion, which will be on Fully Charged. Because COP26 is clearly critical and, on shaky ground with the situation in the world. We're just hoping that it will go ahead and there won't be a sort of a lockdown that messes the whole thing up. And there's enormous need to hold this conference. Anyway, so that's an exciting thing we're working on. I want to do another couple of stories, a couple of positive battery stories, because I think this is interesting, and a negative one, because I think you've got to take there's no black and white, it's all grey. One of the stories I just want to mention before I go into it in detail, I've recorded a load of micro rants, and I'm not sure that I want them to be released, but they've been very cathartic, and they've allowed me to explore topics that we either avoid or skirt around or hint at because it's just too contentious. And one of those topics is Toyota and their attitude to electric vehicles, which over the last 10 years has not been overly brilliant. I think it's fair to say. I won't talk about that now because if we do release that rant, I've sort of explained my position there. But I mean, I've always held them in high regard. I used Toyota Priuses for a long time, and they were amazing cars in their time. But now, finally, in 2021, Someone at Toyota has said, I think we better start working on some battery electric cars, and they are. So they have plans to spend $13.5 billion on battery development in the next, say, 10 years, with the goal of reducing battery costs per vehicle by 50%. So if you reduce the cost of a battery in a vehicle by 50%, you can probably knock 25% off the cost of a new car, which would mean that you could be buying new electric cars with 200 plus mile range for £16,000 new off the lot with no subsidies. And that is going to be the boss of Toyota has said, effectively, I'm going to rephrase it, but this is what he said, that battery electric vehicles sound the death knell for internal combustion engines, and they need longer to transition. I think that's one of the most honest things I've ever heard any boss of any existing car company say. Of course it is. It's really difficult. How on earth, when you've got tens of thousands of people employed making combustion engines, what do? You just say, oh, well, just stop and just make electric motors. It's a really difficult transition, but that's being very kind to them. In reality, they're doing everything they can to delay that change as long as possible, which means we carry on burning fossil fuels that are toxic to us, are toxic to the environment, and we have to send money to regimes that we don't necessarily support. I'm just saying that. Offshore, we're sending billions of pounds of our money to countries, and all European countries are in that position, and North America, not now, but it will be again soon. Just wanted to say that. We can produce our own fuel in our own countries without being reliant on external. That's the conservative side of me coming out. Why are we sending money to these people? I don't want to send them money. I want it to employ people in this country. Anyway, Toyota are releasing the BZ4X, probably the ugliest name in motoring history, and that's going some, which will be a 100% electric car. And they're desperately trying to reduce the amount of electricity used per kilometre by 30%. I mean, that is really impressive. I've just been driving the brand new Hyundai Ioniq 5, which by all measures and all standards is an amazing car. It's incredibly comfy. It has if you're good and careful, a 250 mile range. I can't help being slightly disappointed having driven the original Hyundai Ioniq pure electric, which was, a development vehicle, because you can get a hybrid one with a petrol engine, you can get a plug-in hybrid one, you can get a pure electric. So clearly it wasn't built just as an electric. But I drove that car in mountainous districts for a couple of days and got over 5 miles to the kilowatt hour, easy peasy. And I've spoken to people who've got over 6 on long journeys. And that's what we should be aiming at, is to use less electricity, use less stuff. And the Ioniq 5 is a big car, it's really got my, I know there are people who listen and people who watch Fully Charged who, in large inverted commas, need a massive SUV. They need that and then they'll give you the excuse. And actually, to be honest, it's a really first world excuse. The sporting kit, the 3 kids, and the kit. And you go, okay, no, that's fine. You clearly don't need that car every day. You need it 3 or 4 times a year. And that's really, I'll end up on this podcast talking about that. Anyway, so that's a really good news about Toyota. Toyota will be producing pure battery electric cars, and they will be great cars. Whatever else you think of Toyota, they make amazing cars that last a long time, that are really well built. Ask the Taliban. The Taliban really love a Toyota pickup, quite a new one. Here's a little question, just asking. How do the Taliban, in a country that's pretty much isolated economically, how do they get hold of, this is pre the American withdrawal, how do they get hold of hundreds and hundreds of brand new Toyota pickups? Just asking. Any comments gratefully received. Anyway, That's a really good thing. I'm really pleased that Toyota are trying to reduce the energy use of their vehicles, are trying to reduce the cost of batteries, and are coming up with new battery technologies that use less contentious materials and can be reused. All those things are very important. That leads on to a new study by the ICCT, which is in the United States. It's an international organization. I beg your pardon. The International Council on Clean Transportation. I need to do more research into who they are and who funds them, but they've done a very big study over years, not just the last few months. And they have found that battery electric cars already have a better greenhouse gas emission record than conventionally powered vehicles, and not only in Europe, but also in China, India, or the USA. So what they're saying is, even if your electricity is by European standards quite grubby, let's say by Norwegian standards sort of filthy, because their electricity is so clean, even then it is still a benefit to the rest of the world to use an electric vehicle, which most people listening to this podcast will know already, but it's always good when it's kind of underlined by people who've done an actual study. Of course they're cleaner, and all that garbage and nonsense about them being dirtier is exactly that, garbage and nonsense. And this didn't only include the sourcing of the materials, transportation of the materials, the manufacturing, the use of the vehicle in its lifetime, the secondary use of the battery after the car has fallen to bits because the battery will still go, and then the recycling of the battery and the energy used in that. All those were taken into account. And it's 66 to 69% lower than a comparable petrol vehicle. The impact on the environment, it's much, much less. And I'm just saying this because I know most people listening to this will do that. But when you're in those discussions with people who are going, I think my diesel car is cleaner than an electric one. I used to not want to make a silly voice when I said that, but I've given that up. No. I talk like that. I want to use my diesel because I can drive 600 miles non-stop and then have to get a hospital appointment because my bladder's exploded. Just moronic comments. I saw a load of them on Twitter recently. I just don't get involved. Rise above it. So that I think is a very interesting story. That's I'm going to read this bit. Okay, this is quite an interesting end sentence. If an e-compact car, so let's say something like the ID3 or a Renault Zoe, it's those size cars that we should be encouraging. I know it's difficult because there's not many of them. Smaller cars like that. So if the e-compact car were powered entirely by electricity from renewable energy sources, the battery vehicle would already achieve up to 81% lower life cycle emissions than a petrol vehicle, according to the ICCT. 81% cleaner if it's renewable energy. So if it isn't renewable, if it's just coal, it's then 50% cleaner. Basically, if you power it by human excrement, extract the methane, burn the methane in a really inefficient generator, transmit that electricity down 500 miles of old copper wiring with frayed bits, and then put it in your car, the car is still cleaner. Don't want to talk about it anymore. Boring. Bad story about batteries. A lot of you in the United States will be aware of this. This news has sort of been hinted at in this country, but not in such a big way. General Motors, GM, the GM Volt has the GM Bolt, the Chevy Bolt has had it's so ridiculous, isn't it? Because these stories are so easy but I think there's some real worry here. So there's been 12 fires in these cars, not as a result of accidents, just when they're parked, often when they're charging. 12 fires between 2017 and 2019. The models were built in between 2017 and 2019. Those ones have happened. Non-crash related fires. So one of these. A spokesman for a company called Recurrent, which is a Seattle-based startup that provides battery analysis for EV owners, had stated, and I think this is an important point, it's important for us all to remember that the Bolt recall isn't a battery technology problem, it's a manufacturing quality issue. So what he is saying, Scott is saying, and I think that's an important thing for us to remember, because these stories are always used to try and denigrate and undermine electric vehicles and their use and safety in particular. It's important to remember that is, yes, all technology, especially technology in connection with energy, is inherently dangerous. And I was driving on the motorway last week, going into London, and there was a massive traffic jam, and then it starts to move, and then you keep moving, and then you eventually go past all the flashing lights, and I assumed accident. No, one vehicle, a petrol hatchback, burnt out on the side of the road. No accident, no other vehicles involved. Two people, thankfully, standing behind the safety barrier with the police, looking a little bit unhappy. And their car had literally caught fire while it was driving along, which happens an alarmingly large amount of times with petrol vehicles. And I've looked up the statistics, and there's over 350 people a year on average die in the United States as a result of non-accident related battery fires. And so you could do easily a scare story about that, but it wouldn't. There's 300 million cars in the United States, so it's a tiny percentage of the cars catching fire, both battery and petrol. But it does happen, and it is dangerous, and that's inherently part of the problem. Technology, when it goes wrong, and it always does at some point, doesn't matter how clever your software is or your self-driving capability, stuff goes wrong. We know that. But so the General Motors have recalled 68,000 Bolt EVs in November last year. And Hyundai had a similar. Now, we have a Kona, and that had to go in, and we had a huge lot of checking done for it in, I think, February this year. And we were very lucky. Our one was fine. But they have replaced batteries in some of the cars, and it's to do with the manufacturing of the individual cells. And if there's a problem with one, once you've got a problem with that and it shorts out, then it affects the whole pack, and it can be very nasty. But generally speaking, it's not an explosive fire. It's a slow fire that then develops and is that's the good side, i.e. you can get out the car without catching fire, generally speaking. But the bad side is really hard to put those fires out. Very, very difficult to put them out. And that's that's one of the problems. So GM think there are they initially thought this was a software problem. They updated the software in thousands of cars, but there have been at least 2 Bolt EV fires that had the software update. So that's what prompted General Motors to recall that. So that's all, that's a problem, and it shouldn't be glossed over. And I'm not saying it doesn't happen. Absolutely does happen. It's a concern of mine because we charge our cars in a wooden garage next to a wooden house that we live in. So it's clearly something I do think about. And I'm hopeful that the technology that we have here is safe. And so far, and many years' experience have taught me that generally speaking it is. But you never know. That bad stuff happens, doesn't it? We all know that. One last thing I want to say before I wander off. Got quite properly depressed yesterday. Now, I was driving. I'm not going to do the whole backstory. It's too boring. But I was driving in South London. So it's in a very busy mega city. South London is officially, by global measurements, a mega city. Over 10 million people. Lovely sunny day. A lot of people clearly, it became very apparent very quickly, clearly decided to go out in their cars, to go, I guess, into the countryside or to the seaside or something. And the traffic was catastrophically bad. And this was on a Saturday morning, not a weekday, not a rush hour. It was like 10 o'clock in the morning. And it kind of broke my spirit, because if there's one thing that electric cars don't solve, it's traffic. In fact, they make it worse, if anything. If there's lots and lots of people driving electric cars because they're cheaper and cleaner, that situation could get worse. I think there's quite a lot of disincentive for people at the moment with combustion cars to try and use them less, very sensibly. Although that wasn't very apparent yesterday, I have to say. I mean, though there were other electric cars I saw on the roads, 95% of the cars were sitting still in traffic, in busy streets with loads of pedestrians with their wretched engines ticking over. It is not good. But what it really underlined for me was, and this is the reason I'm saying this, is because I am so privileged. I live out in the sticks. I don't sit in traffic jams because there aren't any. There's just lanes. There's plenty of disadvantages in that as well, but on the whole, traffic isn't one of them. So I can. It's quite easy for me to live in a bit of a bubble where, having an electric car, charging it at home, driving it wherever I want to go is easy. And I lived in London. I know what London's like. So I never drive in London. There was this one specific event that I was driving, and I avoid driving in London because it's stupid, because you don't go anywhere. You just sit still. So here's the basic stats. Yesterday, I sat in a car for 4.5 hours. None of this is exaggerated because I looked on the screen. 4.5 hours, and I'd driven 19 miles, 19 miles in 4.5 hours. And it broke me. I lost the will to live. And I went, this is ridiculous. This is catastrophically stupid. A car is not the solution. Doesn't matter what makes it move. Doesn't matter where the energy comes from. Doesn't matter how clean it is, how efficient it is. It's a stupid, dumb way of trying to move around. I was one person in a big car sitting with a load of other people in big cars. The amount of Range Rovers I saw as I wound my way, not in South London so much, but the amount of big SUVs in South London, it's just sickening. But the amount of Range Rovers in the sort of posh bit, Kensington, Chelsea, that area, in traffic jams, huge, great big diesel tanks, usually with one person in. And I've got to say, generally a woman, on in this massive tank of a car, and you just think, this is so dumb, that we've let this happen. And it's not any one person's fault. I don't even blame JLR for making ridiculous, inefficient tanks that people love. They love them. That's the most common vehicle I see on the roads of the UK, is a huge, chunky, heavy, fuel inefficient, oversized, fat SUV. So daft. Just doesn't make any sense at all. And all the cars have got so much bigger. Well, I can hear the arguments. Well, that's because they're safer as well. Yeah, of course. Of course they're safer if you smash into someone in a smaller car, in a great big 2-3 ton SUV. Yes, you are safer. Dread to think what happens to the other poor people. But that aside, that's a whole other issue. It is just that thing where I go, I'm in this, making this show that I'm really passionate about, that I'm really proud of, that has been very successful. And in a sense, we're promoting people to buy cars. And actually, for a huge percentage of the population, the solution to living in a nicer city, getting around easier, having healthier children, is not a car. This whole thing started, I did an interview, which will be a podcast on next week, with a lovely man who lives right in the middle of Oxford. He's got a Tesla. Many of his neighbours have electric cars. They live on a narrow, quiet, Victorian side street in East Oxford. It's not a big, wide American road where there's room to park a car. It's not a long street in Australia that's very wide. It's a narrow Victorian street that was built to push a barrow down or have a horse and cart going down it, and for people to ride bicycles. It's that scale. It's small, and it's very, very packed. And I drove a big electric car, the Hyundai Ioniq 5, and had to park it there. Now, I could have charged it on a lovely system that a lot of the people there, they're running cables under the pavement. I'm not going to go into the detail about it, but they've worked out a way and they can plug their cars in. So there's no trip hazard. And there's no street furniture. They're running a cable from their house, across their little front gardens, in a channel cut into the pavement, and then up to the car. And it really is faultless. It's a brilliant little system. There's about 7 or 8 electric cars on this short street. It's not a big street. So it's getting on for like a third of the cars that are parked there. But they're all huge. They're massive, great tanks. One of them's an amazing Mercedes EQC. It's a brilliant car. It's huge when you see it in that environment. And you go, and how often are they using these cars? Once every, we know it's about 5% of the time they own them that they're actually in use. Which is why charging a car is totally not a problem. Doesn't matter how slow it charges. You've got 95% of the time you own the car to charge the damn thing, and you use it for 5%. It's just a non-issue. But what is an issue is the size and the visual impact, let alone the environmental one, the visual and physical impact on our cities that cars have. And then the idea, the one thing that gives me some hope is that by the time I pop my clogs, I'm hoping it's a while yet, less people will own private cars and more people will have cars that they can use when they need them. And those will be autonomously delivered to wherever they are, so they can drive them. And that is a topic that I'm going to talk about. But I now have to go because a whole load of people have arrived at my house to look at my batteries. So that's all I'm going to say for this podcast. I hope this was of some interest to some of you. But I'm going to wind it up now, and we'll be back next week with a really interesting podcast with another person. And the long-term aim is that I will eventually organise things. This is one of the things we're trying to sort out now. We'll have a studio, and we'll have 3 or 4 people for every podcast, and different people and some regulars. I'm going to get some of the regulars on. So that's all. That's normal stuff. Subscribe, Patreon, blah, 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 blah. And as always, if you have been, thank you for listening.